Hey guys, hi, welcome back once again. My name is Vaishali, and today I'd like to talk about independence through a different lens. So, having recently celebrated our Independence Day, I was once again reminded of the term independence. And as I looked for the meaning of the word independence, there were a few things that came up. And I'd like to take up one that kind of resonates with our understanding or with our concept of independence as of today. And this was the one that expressed it as we understand it in our common parlance. Independence is not being influenced or controlled by others in matters of opinion and conduct, essentially implying that one's ability to be able to think and act for oneself, or an autonomous and a free thinker and an enactor of those thoughts, which invariably is an implication towards a radical thinker. For how many of us can actually claim that we have not been influenced, are not influenced by the conditions of our society, by the conditions of our family, by the conditions of our religious groups, by the conditions and practices practiced in all of these spectrums, by socio-economic political aspects? How many of us can actually claim that we stop even to question any of the things that we believe in? How many of us even stop to question whether the beliefs that we run our life by, whether the beliefs that we identify with, which frames our mindset and thereby our life, is essentially of our own making and have not been inherited or influenced by any of the conditions from the outside? And in my understanding, since many of us cannot truly claim to have risen above all of that, to not be impacted and influenced by any of that, it made me think about the terms like dependency, codependency, and hyperindependency. Or we can even say the aspects of ourselves that lie in the spectrum of being codependent, of being hyper-independent, of being interdependent. Now, dependency essentially is used for infants, for toddlers, for kids, and even for teenagers or young adults to some degree. Because as human mammals, we actually don't have an alternative but to be dependent on our caretakers for our very survival. It's also applied to people who, due to some unforeseen, unfortunate circumstance, are impaired in some way or the other. Either it's sensory or neuromuscular impairment, because of which they can't really take care of themselves and have to rely on somebody else to take care of them. And just like infants, toddlers, and kids, even these people need caretaking almost all the time, 24/7, round the clock. So that essentially addresses and takes care of the aspect of dependency. However, we also have the concept of codependency, or people who are in codependent relationships. Now, codependents essentially are people who have the need to be needed. And unless they feel needed in some ways or the other by others, they do not really feel good about themselves. They do not really feel complete and whole about themselves. And they generally might come across as being too noble, for they almost always essentially play the role of the caretaker. People who will be there for you at almost all costs possible. The rescuers, the protectors, the providers, the most responsible ones, the ones who shoulder on the responsibility of an able adult individual as well. Now, quite naturally, these people become enablers to the ones who are on the other end of the spectrum. Essentially, people who are looked down upon as being irresponsible, as being immature, as being childlike. People who really don't take care of their physical or emotional health very well. People who are considered to be underachievers, which creates an imbalance of disproportionate ratio. And if you objectively look at it, the people in these relationships have a gaping hole inside of them, One has the gaping hole of being taken care of, and the other has the gaping hole of being needed to take care of the other so that they are equally wanted. And then there are those who are also hyper independent. Now, on the surface, it may come across that these are the people who've got their stuff together, who've even got their together. These are the people who've got everything figured out for themselves. And yet, if we look at the very word itself, hyper independent, it kind of sounds very similar to hypertension. And many psychologists would tell us that it's again a trauma response to an attachment injury informed or experienced in the early formative years of our lives. So, how can something that seems to be all put together be a trauma response? So, how is hyperindependence a trauma response, or rather a reaction that developed in the earlier stages, but with practice has gone on to become a response with time? And in the views of many psychologists, people who are hyper-independent are also the ones who are afraid of vulnerable, deep connections, are afraid of trusting others, had to learn very early in life not to rely on somebody else to take care of their needs because that wasn't done. They had to learn that it was only themselves that they could trust. And thereby the relationships and the world that they live in, that the world they grow in, that the world that they associate with cannot really and truly be relied upon, be depended upon. These people might also have a hard time asking for any kind of a help, asking for any kind of a support or assistance, because compulsive and absolute self-reliancy has become their motto in life. These people also might be perfectionists and controlling in some ways or the other, because to falter would require one to say that I need help, which essentially is very difficult for them. And just like a building which is getting constructed, whose foundations, whose plinth has to be laid, for the building to rise up and come up into its own structure, we as humans are also the same. It is our initial formative foundation years that lay the foundation of our attachment styles, of the way we interact not only with the outside world but with ourselves as well, in manners that we form our associations and our relationships. For it is these informations, the building blocks, that lay the foundation of certain aspects of our lives. Aspects like vulnerability and courage, along with boundaries. Aspects like trust or non-trust. Aspects like having the courage to ask for help when needed, and aspects wherein we feel that asking for help can be a biggest flaw within us. Aspects like dependability and reliability, which cannot get fostered if there is little openness and trust in the relationships. And since on a very primal level we are social creatures by nature, unless and until we look at the history to the making of our story, to the making of us, our history would keep generating and repeating itself over and over and over again, not only in our lifetimes, but in the lifetimes of others that we interact with as well. And I've personally been through a spectrum of all of these attachment styles, right from dependency when I was a kid, to becoming independent, to then experiencing codependency in certain relationships, at times when I was the enabler and at times when I was the receiver of that codependent dynamic, to then becoming aggressively and proudly hyper-independent, wanting to play the Superman or the Superwoman, to someone who's now getting more comfortable with the idea of interdependence. Has it been easy? Of course not, because it takes a lot to dismantle our own ideas about ourselves, to dismantle our own belief systems, to dismantle our own habituated dysfunctionalities that at times we think are functional, to even recognize that the things that might have been functional at one point in time probably are no more functional. Interdependence, or rather healthy independence, also comes with being able to negotiate our negotiables and our non-negotiables, to communicate our expectations, to express our disappointments, and to do that in more mindful ways, while at the same time realizing that many of our negotiables and our non-negotiables, our expectations will change with time. And many a times as a default, we slip back to what is known, to what is familiar. But the better we get at catching ourselves when we make those familiar slips in those familiar spots, we not only give ourselves the permission to make those progress with 3 steps forward, 1 step backward, but we also begin to appreciate and understand our own progress, our own evolution as well. And since the most healthy way of independence, or rather inner dependence, is to understand that we are interdependent, is to embrace our interdependence, it's also essential to remember that what does not grow together grows apart. So let's try and reflect on our formative years that informed us of our attachment styles, of the way we relate to ourselves and to others. Are we in a codependent dynamic? Are we hyper independent? How have those mechanisms at times truly helped us and at times sabotaged us as well? How have those mechanisms helped us grow together, and how have those mechanisms helped us grow apart? Until we reflect on the making of the history of that foundation, till we become aware of it, until we become aware of the benefits and the losses that it has curtailed for us or curated for us, it's quite difficult to make changes because our subconscious and our unconscious likes to stick to what it knows best, likes to stick to what it's habituated to. Let's try and reflect on that, and let's try and figure that out for ourselves. And I will see you once again the next week. Till then, stay tuned in. And guys, if you do like the contextual content of these videos, please do like, share, and subscribe.